All right. We have one more session before our networking break. Up next, we have our friend from Southwest Nebraska. His name is Dr. Brent Gloy. He is an agriculture economist. He is a customer of Schooler, a farmer operating his family farm down there in Southwest Nebraska, and he's going to talk to us a bit today about some more trends in agriculture. He also happens to have a couple of tenured positions in his past at Purdue and Cornell, so he's kind of a big deal. Please welcome him to the stage, Dr. Gloy.
It is great to be here today. What a cool event. What a cool venue. This is pretty awesome. And I get to talk to you about what I think is one of the cooler topics that I usually talk about, which is what is happening in trends in agriculture and how are they going to impact our business, all of our businesses going forward. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'll just briefly outline them. What we want to talk about today are what I think are 5 of the most important things. They're going to shape agriculture, not just in the next 6 months, but probably 6 to 10 years. So we're taking a little bit longer view here, and that's nice because when we do that, we can speak with a lot more confidence. If you ask me what the price of corn is going to be tomorrow or 6 months from now, I really don't have very much, foresight. If I did, I probably wouldn't be here today. But these things that I'm going to talk to you about, I have a high degree of confidence in, a high degree that a lot of these things are going to happen. So let's go ahead and start. But before we do, what I want you to do is think back to the turn of the century, which feels really weird for me to say that, right? That was like 2000, we had a century turnover, right? That seems like not that long ago for me. For some of you are like, I wasn't even barely born. But I want you to think about a couple things. Just put yourself back in 2000. And I'm going to give you a couple statistics that I think, just started thinking about how much things have changed. What do you think the national average corn yield was in 2000? Today, it's 181 bushels an acre. In 2000, it was 134. That's a lot. That's a lot of change in 20 years. Think back to the technology. We had yield monitors, we had GPS, but think how much different they were then as opposed to today, and how much improvement has happened with that technology over time. If you think back to economics, we had something called LDP, which somebody mentioned earlier today. Roundup worked, okay, as a farmer. Roundup Ready corn was introduced in 1998. China was not buying meaningful quantities of any agricultural commodities from the United States. Okay? Think about that for a second. Today, by about 1/3 of all the soybeans produced in the United States. Okay, 60% of all the global soybeans traded in the world go to China. 20 years ago, basically nothing. This state, North Dakota, 2022 planted 5.7 million acres of soybeans. In 2000, 1.9. So just amazing change, almost 3 times as many acres planted in this state, over twice as much corn. Last year, almost 3 million acres. In 2000, it was 1.08 million acres. So some big changes happen over that kind of a time frame. And I want us to just think about how that might happen in the future. Now, the first trend I want to talk to you about is global production and demand is changing. And that change is going to have profound implications for us. But what it also does is it encourages the cycles that we're used to in production agriculture. And David, my partner David Widmar and I like to talk about the production cycle of agriculture. It kind of follows this roller coaster pattern of stability, long stretches of stability where we produce commodities at roughly the cost of production. So farmers make very little margins. And I think back to our farm, that LDP era. You want to know how much money my parents were making farming? Just go look it up in the old environmental working group. Remember that database? That's basically what their net income was, because we were producing roughly at cost, okay? And that goes on for long periods of time. And then occasionally we get these things called booms. They're always set off by demand shocks. The most recent one in the United States, big one, was the ethanol boom. And that set off a big explosion upward in prices. Occasionally, they're set off by supply side things, but those usually don't last as long. This most recent one, more of a supply issue. We've had 3-4 years of really subpar crops that have tightened commodity stockpiles. And eventually we catch up with production. Then we go through this cost squeeze. We usually overshoot it on the downside, things get a little tough, and then we get back to some sort of stability. Now, everybody can sit here and go, yeah, I see that cycle. I've lived it, I understand it, but why? And as an economist, I'm like, well, there's a really obvious reason. And the obvious reason is this chart right here, and this is the world acreage harvested around the world, global acreage harvested of the 13 primary crops. And this chart, if you don't think about it very long, it's just like, well, it goes up, it's flat, it goes up, so what? But if you start looking at that, you start to see some really interesting dates. 1960s to 1972, especially starting in 1969, we saw a really steep increase in world acreage. Remember, they're not making any more farmland, at least that's what we've been told, right? I mean, that's what we hear, but the reality is world acreage has gone up tremendously over this time period. Why did it start going up in the 70s? When I went to Purdue as a graduate student, I got a special scholarship, and it was from a professor named Earl Butz. Before in his younger days, he was Secretary of Agriculture. And he made a deal with the Russians in the 70s, and it resulted in what some people call the Great Grain Robbery. He sold the entire U.S. grain reserve to the Russians, who were our arch enemy at the time, right? And it sent commodity prices going upward. He came home, told American farmers to do what? Plant fence row to fence row. They did. And acreage took off. And then it hit the wall in 1981, and it stayed flat for a long time. And as an economist, we like those lines that are going up like that because they're really easy to forecast. You just lay a ruler down, you go, that's what acreage is going to be next year. Well, it didn't do that. Why not? What was happening in the 1980s? Jimmy Carter became president. The Russians did something we didn't like, invaded a country. We had our own experience there as well. It was Afghanistan. We didn't really know what to do, so we came home. Jimmy Carter said, I got to do something. We're not going to send our athletes to the Olympics. That will teach them, right? Did it? No, it didn't faze them a bit. So he came out and said, I guess we're going to embargo grain. Grain markets tanked. At the same time, we had a Federal Reserve new chairman who finally came in and said, you know what, I'm going to stop inflation. And I don't care how much pain I inflict, I'm going to stop it. And he took rates really high, and there are probably farmers that you have as clients that survived 20% operating lines of credit, 20% interest rates on their lines of credit. If they did, you should be in awe of those people because that was really, really difficult. And it sent the economy into ag economy into a major depression in the 80s, and we were flat all the way till over here, roughly 2004, 2005, and that line starts going up. What happened there? George W. Bush walks out of the State of the Union, stops to see Senator Charles Grassley from Iowa and says, was that enough for you? What was he talking about? He had just proposed the first renewable fuel standard, RFS 1, to start blending major amounts of ethanol into the gasoline supply. And we went up, up, up. We kind of plateaued for a little bit, and now we're going up again. This acreage response we will live with, because the one thing you can see about this line is, does it ever go down for a meaningful amount of time? No. We have this much acreage, and we're going to deal with it for a long, long time. The other thing that's fascinating about this is, where does this acreage come from? This is data 2000, roughly 2018, 2020, the average of that time period to kind of smooth it out, versus 2000 to 2002. South America, in that time period, increased acreage 100 million acres. Now, it just sounds like a number, right? Doesn't mean much. Put it in context. How many acres of corn do we grow in the United States? We're only about 90 million this year, I guess, somewhere in that neighborhood. They added a growing region that big in 20 years. This is going to continue to change going forward. There is more potential for acreage increase, so we're going to have more commodity to deal with. The other thing, though, that's working in our favor is our friends in China have a problem, and I call it their 100 million acre problem. And this chart shows, in blue is the acres harvested in China, and in red is the acres needed to supply whatever it is they buy, whether it's soybean, corn, cotton, whatever. So we've kind of converted this into, if they're buying so many acres of soybean or so many bushels of soybean, it takes so many acres. There's some mental mathematical gymnastics involved in this. But the message, in my opinion, is very clear. How many acres of cropland do they have in China? Well, it's pretty darn close to 300 million, because if they had more to expand, would they? I got to believe they would. How much do they need? Somewhere around 400 million acres worth of land. They've got a problem. They're going to be a big consumer for a long time, and as their income continues to increase, that demand is likely to continue to increase. I think that's very clear. So we've got a good demand story here. Notice, by the way, when those lines switched was about 2000, about that time period we went back to, where they had to start buying commodities in big scale. So that's really good for agriculture. The other side is kind of like, I got a lot of competition coming, it's gonna be tough. But if we just look at what this has done to commodity markets, it's really amazing. The upper left is soybeans. The yellow lines are how much they produce. The gray is how much they consume. The green is their share of world total global imports. 60% of all soybeans in the world go to China today that are exported. It's an amazing number. Beef in the bottom left, look at how that trend has increased recently, up to 30%. Here's another interesting one, corn. China has always been a very large corn producer. They have recently started buying. Will that trend continue? I would say that it's more than likely it probably will, barring a major calamity, which we're going to talk about in a bit. So I think the story there, more production, different places, and hopefully continued growing demand. Now, the second key trend is technology and productivity are going to continue to evolve rapidly. As I said, trend yield 20 years ago was 50 bushels less than it is today on corn. That's a lot. That's a lot. It's a lot more stuff to deal with. Think about just North Dakota adjusting to almost three times as many acres of corn. What the infrastructure is required to do that. Soybeans, same way. Very, very different. Technology and productivity are going to continue to evolve and evolve rapidly. Now, I think when we look at it, this is a robotic weeder. It's thinning lettuce, okay? There's lots of applications for this kind of stuff that are going to happen. But what we've got to remember is this stuff is evolving very rapidly, and it's changing. Some of the stuff that's super hyped may win. Some of it may not. We were talking about sub-acre precision agriculture 20 years ago. When I was a graduate student, there was one of the professors wanted me to work on precision agriculture, like figuring out, how much fertility to put here and there and all that stuff. And I looked at it like, that's why I put in the too hard drawer. Okay? It's too hard. It's where economists' careers went to die. Because they'd work on it is so tempting. And you keep thinking the answer's right around the corner. We just never have quite got there. You even heard that on the panel this morning. Like, we've kind of backed off of that a little bit. It will get better over time. I'm willing to bet on that. Your farmers are going to use more technology in the future than they do today. If you're behind the curve on technology and communicating with your farmers, you're going to get yourself in trouble. It's really important, I believe, to build those relationships. And when, at first technology used to scare retailers like, we don't want it to be disintermediated, because you'd have these guys from hotshot tech companies in California be like, we're going to run the farm from San Francisco, right? Well, the people in this room know that ain't happening, right? You got to have people that have relationships with the customers. The technology is a tool. It's an enabling tool. It's an enabling tool to help you build better relationships with your customers, because I can't be an expert in all this technology, but I want the people I work with to know it. They've got to know it, and they've got to bring me solutions that work. And I think that human interaction is really, really important. Yeah, there's ways to make, the offers and stuff. That's great. It's really nice. That makes me want to do business with that company, but I still want to have a relationship with that grain buyer. It's really important to do that. And so I think bringing those solutions to your customers is going to be really, really important. The other thing that's going to happen, you're going to have lots of new competitors. People are going to come out of nowhere, going to do different things. You're going to have different partnerships that people work with. It's going to be really important to bring your customers, because no one company can do all of this, right? It's very hard for one company to put all these solutions together under one umbrella. So I think it's really important to work on partnerships. The other thing I always challenge people to think about is how much underutilized technology do farms and your customers have, and you have in your operation today, with a little bit of work could be used more efficiently in your operation. The next big trend, and Julie talked about this one a lot in her State of the Farm report, is changing demographics. And I love demographics, and this is a great quote, and I'm going to read it to you. Of all the external changes, demographics, defined as changes in population, size, age, structure, composition, employment, educational status, etc., are the clearest. They're unambiguous. They have predictable consequences, and they have a major impact on what will be bought by whom and in what quantities. And Peter Drucker wrote that all the way back in 1985, okay? And it's a really good book if you want to read something as ancient as that, but it's a really important point, and there are some major demographic shifts taking place in the farm sector. The biggest one is the age distribution. And as her thing showed, farmers are getting older, okay? Now, you can think about that. It's funny because it was one of the most controversial. I got more comments on stuff we wrote. David and I wrote a paper, talked about the aging of farmers, and people, oh my God, we're going to run out of farm. No, that is not, we are not. I will tell you exactly how many acres are not going to be farmed in North Dakota because we don't have any young farmers. 0, okay? It's going to be farmed. What's going to happen? Farms are going to get bigger, okay, and there's going to be a transition. And the biggest question I think a lot of retailers have to ask themselves is, how well are we positioned with that younger generation? Because eventually, they're going to be in charge of it. It's going to happen. And I challenge you to think 20 years ago what your community looked like, in your retail community, customer base looked like then versus today. And I'll bet it's a lot different. A lot bigger customers, a lot fewer customers, more of your activity associated with a few customers, okay? It's really important to get positioned with that younger next generation. We have great relationship with Dad. Well, that's great, but you ever talk to Junior? What's Junior thinking? Well, I don't know. He's going to do what Dad tells him. Well, until Dad finally says, you know what, I'm done, then what? Junior might have a whole lot of ideas, and you might want to know what some of those are. Really important to get positioned there. The other one I like to point out, because this one's in the news a lot. What's the story in China? Everybody's saying what? Oh my God, their population is going to be in decline. They're just going to zero, right? You listen to some of these guys talk, and they're like, gosh, the world's going to hell. Japan's going to like fall off they're not going to be a functioning society. Yeah, in 2100. I'm not making decisions for 2100, okay? I don't know about you guys, but I think I'm going to let somebody else worry about that. What I can tell you is that Asia, which is in purple, their population is going to continue to grow for most of our working careers, okay? And that's a good thing, and we don't want to lose sight of that. That's going to be where a lot of our markets are at going forward. The other thing that's happening is most of the population of the world, if you look at the left chart, there's total population is the top line. We're up to what? It's like 8,000 million, which is what? 8 billion, right? Okay. The rest, there's about 1 billion of them in developed economies. The rest are in emerging economies. And here's what's happening to purchasing power. Something important changed in roughly 2010. Those economies now have greater purchasing power than the developed economies. Where are your markets going to be? In the emerging economies. We have to be positioned to sell to them. I'm going to skip this one in the interest of time. The other thing, though, that I think, and this is where it gets a little murky, because right now it seems to me that globalism is being put to the test. Now, when I was a new professor at Cornell, I started a course there, and I believe it was the first one ever named this in the country. It's called Global Agribusiness Management. It was a new kind of concept, and that was in 2000, okay? And as part of that class, I made those students read that book in the top left. It's called The Lexus and Olive Tree. If you haven't read it, it's a wonderful book. It was by Thomas Friedman, and it talks about the tensions of globalization and how people were getting better off through trade and globalism. It was really kind of a mantra of globalism is here, it's going to change the world, and it's going to be really important. And I kind of, that was the model for 20 years. Then all of a sudden, we find ourselves today where I think, we had COVID, we have supply chain problems, we don't really get along with our largest trading partner in China. What on earth is going on with this global thing? Another great book to read is called Prisoners of Geography. If you really want to understand what's happening in the world, that is an excellent book. It talks a lot about the dynamics of what is going on around the world. This picture in the middle, Mr. Putin, he looks a little younger then. What was he doing then, that time? He was marching with his generals somewhere. He had just invaded the Crimea at that time, okay? That seems like old news, doesn't it? Now he's got another fish on the hook, okay? Have trade war between the United States and China. You have, there's the, what was that ship's name? I want to say it was the Evergreen, but it was the one that crashed in the Suez Canal. Ever Ready, something like that. Okay, and shut down global trade. And when we started to get aware of how tightly these global supply chains are connected, and I think people starting to say, maybe we ought to reshore some of this stuff. Now, my question is this trend toward trying to kind of get a little bit away from globalism going to last or not? And my thinking as an economist is no, I don't think it will, because I'm a firm believer in the gains of trade, and I think we'll figure out a way to make it continue. But it is not going to be without its ups and downs and present a lot of risks to a lot of your customers. Because if we start another trade war with China, we got big problems. I mean, you saw it last time. How much did that cost the soybean market? we got those payments. They're about $1.85 a bushel, I believe, for soybeans, and that's about what I figure it cost, right? It was a lot when you have to reroute global trade flows. The other one, and this is where I think our friends in the South, we're in a much better position. This is Farm Doc data on fertilizers, how dependent they are on imported fertilizers. Brazil on the left, United States on the right. See, we are in a much better position on everything except potash. All the rest of them, they are very, very dependent. Why is Brazil not super aggressive against Russia's invasion of the Ukraine? Who's one of the big suppliers of a lot of those fertilizers they buy? They got to have it. They're a little bit in a less comfortable position, I think, than we are on this dimension. So lots of things going on, but at the end of the day, if we don't trade in the way we've come accustomed to, it will put a bit of a crimp in ag style. I don't think that's going to happen, but it's something we have to monitor carefully. Finally, there is substantial macroeconomic uncertainty today. More so than any time I've experienced in my professional career. And I found this quote by John Bates Clark. He wrote it in 1898. He's a famous economist, mathematician. There's medals named after him and all that kind of stuff. And he said, "The modern world regards the business cycle as much as the ancient Egyptians regarded the overflowing of the Nile. The phenomenon recurs in intervals, and so of great importance to everyone, and its natural causes are not in sight." He said that in 1898. Unfortunately, I don't think we know a lot more about the situation today. What we know is that the Fed is busy building a dam in the proverbial Nile right now of credit, trying to slow the amount of credit into the economy to do what? Slow economic activity, thereby slowing inflation. That's the thing a lot of people don't like to hear, is that, you'll hear politicians say, "Well, God, we want to raise interest rate and stop inflation, but we don't want a recession." Oh, wait a second, it doesn't work that way, right? I mean, why? The Fed has one tool they can control. They have a great gig, okay? If you're going to have a monopoly on something, having it on the money supply, it's good business, right? But that's all they can control is the money supply. We've got inflation. We look to them to slow it down. What are they going to do? They're going to contract the money supply, contract credit, slow economic activity, i.e. cause a recession. They don't really want to say that out loud, but that's what's going to happen. And I think it's interesting when you start looking through what some of the statements have been lately. Hey, there's signs of a soft landing as the Fed's trying, we're not going to have a hard landing. It's going to be soft, and it's Goldilocks. If Jerome Powell just can guide that airplane just in perfectly, right? It's just going to land. It's going to be perfect, okay? Then you've got Jamie Dimon saying, "Hey, we could hit 6% interest rates, maybe even higher." Larry Summers saying, "Man, we could face a Wile E. Coyote moment here pretty soon. They keep raising rates, we may just drop off the cliff, have a really bad recession." Chair Powell says, "Hey, we're going to be higher than expected and probably longer than expected." Dr. Doom, Nouriel Roubini, "A perfect storm of recession, debt, and out of control inflation is coming for markets." Man, this sounds pretty rough, doesn't it? So you've got all kinds of different perspectives, from soft landing to really hard. But here is the nuts of the whole argument. This is an exchange between Senator Elizabeth Warren, not your one of the more liberal senators, I guess, we have in the United States, Massachusetts, and Jerome Powell. Chair Powell, if you could speak directly to the 2 million hardworking people who have decent jobs today, who you're planning to get fired over the next year, what would you say to them? How would you explain your view that they need to lose their jobs? Those are the days when you're glad you're not the Fed chair, right? Thanks, Senator. He says, "Well, I would explain to those people more broadly that inflation is extremely high, and it's hurting the working people of this country badly, all of them. Not just the 2 million, but all of them are suffering under high inflation, and we are taking the only measures we have to bring it down." Remember, one tool, constrict the money supply to try and reduce inflation. Jay Powell's job is about to get a heck of a lot harder. Because as he keeps raising interest rates, if we don't get the fall in inflation, he's going to have to keep going if he really wants to. He's going to have to either keep going and put us into recession to get rid of the inflation, or capitulate and say, we're going to live with 4% inflation. Either one of those choices is not real good. He's going to take a lot of heat. Paul Volcker regularly got boxes of manure delivered to the Eccles building in Washington, D.C. Powell, I don't think, has been getting it yet, but I would expect before this is over, he will. Okay? Let's see here. So we're kind of run out of time, and I just want to say this inflation story, it's perplexing, okay? We've got relatively high levels of inflation, the highest we've had since all the way back to the 80s. Yet, where's my unemployment slide? I don't have it in here. Yet we have really low unemployment. What's that do? That gives the Fed cover to do what? Raise interest rates. And here's the Fed funds rate. Here's where they're at. Now only thing you want to look at on this chart is every time that Fed funds rate starts going up, you see a little gray shaded area. What's the gray shaded area? Recession. You cannot find very many cases. There's one in the mid-90s where they started raising rates and it did not cause a recession for a long time. That was the maestro's turn, Alan Greenspan, okay? But almost every other time you see an increase in the Fed funds rate, you see a recession. I would expect that's going to happen. But the other thing we've got to think about is what has been the impact of these low interest rates? What I want you to think about, you think that hasn't caused anything in this economy. Think to yourself, McDonald's in the community you go to has been remodeled in the last 5 years or not? Almost all of them have. Why? Because interest rates were damn low. How many new car washes are in Fargo, in almost every other? Why do those exist? Low interest rates, really cheap money. Why did stock prices go up so much? Really low interest rates. Why did house prices go up so much? Really low interest rates. And of course, why did farmland go up so much? Really low interest rates. Now, that being said, the income side of the story is good in farms. I'm not worried about farmland falling out of bed as long as the income story stays up. You change the income story and we got big problems, okay? And that's kind of where I want to end because this just recaps it. I appreciate your time today. I appreciate your patience with me. And I don't know if we have a time for a question or not. No? Yes? No? No, she's saying no. Get out. I do have a plane to catch. I wish I could spend more time with you. I've enjoyed it immensely. Glad to meet all of you, and I wish you the best.